I actually chose a certain title for myself when I came to New Vision. It wasn't senior pastor, it wasn't head pastor, it was lead pastor. It was a very strange title because this is the first lead situation that I was in. But I remember what it was like to be a not lead pastor, a kind of lower pastor on the totem pole. I remember what it was like actually to be working in science and in an environment where you would think the scientists are nice, they're just really cared about the truth. Man, they're vicious, they're political. So I remember what it was like to work in work settings where everyone just wanted to be the boss. Because when you're the boss, all the privileges are yours. Okay? When you're the boss, you get to decide where you want to go, and people just have to follow you there at your disposal. They have to work late, because I had to work late, because my boss wanted to get something done. Everything revolves around the boss. Sometimes this becomes kind of poison to our souls, because we work so hard, and it's not that we receive the benefits, it's the boss, right? Here's a quick commercial from E-Trade. I don't know if you've seen this one, but here we go. The harder you work, the better vacation your boss gets to go on. So what's your thought? Why are they saying that? You got to be the boss because that's what you want to be, like a boss. That's what life is about. You don't want to stay in the entry-level position and be the peon forever. In fact, advancement is the name of the game. And we go and read all these leadership books. We go and do all these seminars. We work our tails off to do what? So that we can be like a boss. Some of my pastor friends, they've been doing this for a little while, and they just having been in that situation, they always use the example of, I don't like being I want to be the lead dog, because the view of the dog that was not in the lead is not very pleasant. You get the view of the lead dog's butt, or the dog in front of you's butt, right? It's not very pleasant, and the odor isn't pleasant either, right? It's something that actually isn't built in our corporate environments to really go after, to incentivize. Nobody wants to stay in the bottom. Everybody wants to be on the top of this org chart. You don't want to be that guy on the bottom, right? Well, as we're looking today, as we're following in our series on what it means to follow Jesus, Jesus actually speaks to what it means to be like a boss in the kingdom of God. He speaks to what leadership should look like. The kind of leadership that he lives out, that he models, and he actually mentors us in. And we're going to find, as maybe you've heard this kind of context before, it is so countercultural that to be a boss means to gather all the privilege, all the position, all the power, and direction to yourself for your benefit. But actually we're finding that Jesus flips it upside down. What does it look like to lead like Jesus? What does great leadership look like through the eyes of Jesus? And so we're looking at that today. We're almost finished. Next week is Thanksgiving, and then we have one more, and then we're going to finalize our Grace Group series. And it's been a tough series for some because we're spending a long time in this theme. I actually was preaching to the youth last week, and I think Pastor Richard mentioned that the youth were dying. They're like, oh, can we do something else now? Their attention spans are not always that long. But I was convinced just how important this is, that we so often talk about how it is great to experience God, and there's so much love, there's so much grace, there's so much benefit, but there is no way to really walk with God in a sustained manner. There's really no way to become like God without this incredible challenge to follow him in all aspects of our lives. And for today, we're talking about what it means to follow him when we are put into not only the position, but the opportunity to lead. How can we lead others in a way that's following the very pattern and the very heart of Jesus and how he leads? So we're going to follow through the book of Mark today in a story where Jesus highlights this very specifically. So as we normally do, I try to unpack what we're looking at, because these are real stories. These aren't simply just religious texts. These are real people, and their responses are real, and sometimes we need to put ourselves in those situations to kind of grasp what's going on. And as we follow this story, I'm also believing that God knows how to kind of prompt us. And so pay attention to that. Pay attention to where he puts a little pressure, where he's saying, and as a part of how are we to respond to not just the story that's on the page, but Jesus, who is the one that we're called to lead, who is our leader and we're called to follow. So this is what's going on. This is near toward the end. And the book of Mark is very interesting. His pattern of the book of Mark is Jesus jumps onto the scene. There's no birth narrative. There's nothing. He jumps onto the scene. And he's doing all this ministry, and he's like moving really fast. 40 times the book of Mark talks about immediately, immediately, immediately. It's like really fast. But if you look at it, a good third of the book of Mark focuses on his last week on the Passion. That's the culmination of what's going on. And it's been moving toward that way. Luke is even more so. It talks about this route to Jerusalem, because Jesus knows that this is the heavy lifting of his ministry. Yes, he spends 3 years with his disciples, but he's about to go to the cross. And as they're approaching Jerusalem, there is this language of they were on their way to Jerusalem. This is kind of like the penultimate scenes where they're moving toward what's going to happen in Jerusalem. But the expectations of the disciples are different from the expectations of Jesus. Pay attention, I'm going to come back to this, but it says, when they were on their way to Jerusalem, in other translations it'll say, as they were ascending, okay? Because that word ascending in the original language actually has some meaning, has some weight. Jesus is going up, and as they're ascending, as you normally do to get up to Jerusalem, their expectations are that he's ascending to a place where he's going to be crowned. He's going to come into authority. He's going to come into power, where they're expecting this. They've been expecting this for hundreds of years. And so they're getting excited, okay? They've been seeing Jesus do incredible things, heal the sick, cast out demons. They're seeing people's hearts and lives and bodies are being restored. And all is a sign that God is on the move. And so these disciples who have been with him, they're astonished, as it says, and they're excited. It says that those who followed were afraid. That's another word for not just terrified, but it's a word that's used when God is moving and they are just amazed. They're a little kind of afraid, like, oh, this is not normal. God is doing something huge. And so can you imagine just how much the hype must have been like, the expectation, something that you've been waiting for a very, very long time. Kind of like 8 years ago when Obama was becoming president, there were people who've been waiting for that for such a long time. The hype was crazy. Now multiply that by hundreds, right? So this is what they're expecting. They're expecting that if Jesus is ascending, coming to the crown, coming to take his power, guess what? Then there's going to be a pecking order to follow. And as you realize, there is already somewhat of a pecking order of closeness, of responsibility. So amongst the 12, you've got Peter, who's kind of like the leader of the 12. If Jesus is the alpha dog, he's the beta dog, right? And then you've got John and James, who are kind of always with Peter, but they're always there. But they're one rung a little lower than Peter. And this is the assumption of the disciples. And then they give the rest of the 10, right? Well, James and John, actually, you're going to see, going to do something interesting. They're going to use this opportunity because they realize Jesus is ascending, and they want to be on his coattails. So Jesus, realizing this, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen. Kind of like, don't expect everything's all great. And now, all 3 years of you following me and suffering and so on and so forth, it's going to be worth it. Because when we go up to Jerusalem, right, the Son of Man is not going to be crowned with power and authority, not yet. Instead, he's going to be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They're not going to follow him, or follow me, actually speaking about himself. They're going to condemn him, right? They're going to condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit him and flog him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise. So if you're hearing this story, and Jesus saying, don't get all excited, I'm not going to come into power, right? This is going to happen to me. Then wouldn't you think? You'd be like, oh, snap. You should have told me this earlier, Jesus. I wouldn't have followed you then. Or you'd be like, oh, now what are we going to do? We've got to get ready. It doesn't even faze John and James. Okay? They've watched Jesus for 3 years. They've seen how he cared for the lost. They've seen how he gave up all of his privileges. They've seen what he was about. And they were following for 3 years, but somehow there's this strange blindness when it comes to their ambition. Strange blindness. They just assumed that when Jesus comes into his power, they would be able to be like a boss, as the rest of the world always wanted and always expected. So right after Jesus says this stuff, I'm going to be, condemned to death, and I'm going to be flogged, and I'm going to be spit at, I'm going to die, and then I'm going to be raised again. What happens happening? John and James, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. They said, "Teacher, it's not, how can we follow you? What can we do to be ready for all of this?" They say, "We want you to do for us whatever we ask." Okay? So anybody asks you that? Okay, if your daughter, I have two daughters, and whenever they ask me that, you know something's coming. You know something big's coming. They're buttering up Jesus, right? They're preparing him for a big ask. Okay, so Jesus responds, "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." So what is that saying? What are they thinking? You're going to come into power. You're going to be president. You're going to be king. And kings don't really do that much. They get presidents do a lot, but it's the chief of staff who really owns the power. We want to be the movers and shakers, left and right, the most trusted, the most authoritative, except of you, of course, Jesus. We want it. We want to be like a boss. Yeah. It's kind of funny. And here, James they look like they're the ones who are wanting it. In the book of Matthew, Matthew tells us that it's their mom. The mom asked, right? It's so Asian, don't you think? It's the mom who is actually fighting for her sons, right? I always laugh when I reflect on that story. I can see my mom doing that, because that's what she thought. That's what they think love is, to see their children propagated to the highest mark, right? Well, anyway, Jesus responds, trying to get them to finally get it. Do you really know what you're asking? We want to be great. We want to sit to the left and right of your glory. We want to be leaders. We want to be like a boss. Do you know what you're asking? And he asks them, are you able to drink the cup of suffering that I'm going to drink? Are you able to go through the kind of baptism of blood that I'm going to go through? Do you know what it's going to take to be great in the kingdom of God? And they said, yes. Okay, whatever it costs, we will pay for us to be great. Yeah. And sometimes we take that attitude as well. We know it's going to be long hours. We know it's going to be a cat fight. We know it's going to be tough. But it's something, when ambition and when desire takes control of us, we would rather do that than be in the bottom. And Jesus is gracious. He says, okay, but it's not for me to say, right? It actually is going to speak to how John and James are going to experience suffering because they're going to follow Jesus. But he doesn't say yes to them. He just prepares them. Yeah. But as John and James are applying this to Jesus, all the disciples are hearing this, right? So this was kind of a bold move. This wasn't the John and James saying, Jesus, come over here. Let me make a backroom deal. It's right in front of them. They're like, what nerve? And they are indignant. They are so angry. Like, how dare you? Or they're probably thinking to themselves, man, I should have gone first. They're probably thinking to themselves, oh, they grabbed the opportunity. I was just a little late. Because why are they so indignant? They wanted to. They wanted to. Here, Jesus has to stop. He has to make it very, very clear. He says, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, these are the kings, these are the Caesars, these are the governors, okay? They lord it over them. They lord it over everybody that they have authority over. The bosses of their time make the bosses of our time look like wimps, okay? They had all kinds of power. They were all kinds of corrupt. It was all about them. It's all about their position. Okay, maybe not that bad. Maybe not that much worse than we are now. But just try to imagine how, without accountability, without regard, this is how the bosses lived. And so if you're sitting underneath one of them, you don't want to be in that position. You want to be in the one who actually is freed from that and be able to do what you want to do. And he's saying, that's the system of leadership that's in place. That's the system of leadership that was in place then, and that's the system of leadership often that is still in place now. But he makes a strong break and he says, not so with you. Anyone who's a Christ follower, okay, who maybe we hear it again and again and again, but it doesn't just sink in. We come to church and we hear, oh, this is what it means to lead like Jesus, to be a servant leader, to give up your rights. We hear it again and again and again, but we just don't hear it. He has to make it so clear. And the way he makes it clear is he makes it in a hyperbolic way. He flips it upside down. Saying, you want to be great? You want to be at the top? You want to be first? You want to be a boss? Let me show you what a boss looks like in the kingdom of God. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Okay? Whoever wants to be first must be a slave to all. Right? That word servant and slave, they're similar, but slave basically reminds you, because they had slavery back then, where your whole life, forever, your purpose of your life is to benefit your master in however way your master decides. If your master is a masochist and he gets pleasure from your pain, that's what you're supposed to do as a slave. To benefit your master, that's what your life is about. It is a horrible injustice, of course, but in fact, that's what he's saying. The first, the greatest among you, don't sit there and ask to be a boss and have everybody benefit them. All the power and position is for them. It's the flip opposite. What it means to be a leader, what it means to look like Christ in his leadership, is to do that. And he says right after this in verse 45, for even the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many. He became a slave for all. And it didn't sink into their hearts. They didn't understand. And I think it's such a strong difference from the way that we experience leadership, even as a child. Parents will tell, if parents tell you to do something, and most of the times parents are this way, even loving parents, and the child's like, no. It's like, why? Because I said so. It's this strong sense of leadership is you decide and everybody else follows. And sometimes we don't see it. But Andy Stanley has a very clear way of explaining to us what leadership and what great leadership looks like in the kingdom of God. When Jesus sees our leadership, this is the test that he applies. This is the test. Whether we are leveraging, turning, using, intending, and applying all of our authority, all of the places that we do have decision-making power, all the places of power, position, and influence that we have, are we leveraging it for the benefit of the very people who are under our authority? Or are we leveraging it for ourselves? The Gentiles leverage everything for themselves. The bosses, that's what they expect, right? You work hard for their vacation. But this is the interesting part. Jesus says, flip it upside down. That's the test, the definition of the test of leading great. If anyone wants to be great among you, first you must be a slave to all. You would think, man, this is like no way to run a business, right? This is no way to be a parent. Because if you let the kid decide, you'd be eating ice cream every meal, right? If you're doing it it feels like you are absolving yourself not only of the privileges of all the power too. How effective can this kind of leadership be when you are leveraging everything for the benefit of the very people that are under your authority? It doesn't make sense. Servant leadership for many of us is an oxymoron. And we think, how practical can it be? Can it work in our marketplace? Can it work when things are very real? Can it work in our families? Can it work in our friendships even, in our nonprofit or even our church organizations? Yeah. I remember when I went to a church, and I shared that I went to this church. My first experience of being in a church, I was low pastor on the 14 pastor totem pole. Yeah. So I had the least voice, the least salary, and the least kind of influence. And so I remember going in, and it was a very strange feeling for me because this is a whole different environment. And the first day I show up at the staff meeting in a language that I don't actually get comfortable with, the senior pastor over the 14 is introducing me to the rest of the 13 pastors and saying, "This is our new pastor. His name is Martin Chang," and he looks at me and he says, "This is your job description," in front of everybody else, right? "Your job is to help me with my ministry." And I was like, "This is a church? This is a church?" I was like, I didn't say that. Maybe my eyes said it, but in my heart, I'm like, I thought I came here to serve Jesus. I didn't know I came here to serve you, right? But that's how things ran. And in fact, when I was starting ministry with these guys, and they were, they were well trained, but I realized they wanted this heavy-handed, almost, because it was a military town, military style. They grew up in a military home. A lot of their fathers were drill sergeants. Can you imagine? Right? And so I came in and I talked about how Jesus talks about servant leadership, and they're like, they just didn't believe me. And they would pull me to the side and like, you can't do it like this. You're going to fail. You're going to get fired. Right? They're like, you got to crack whip. You got to crack whip. I'm like, what am I on, Friends? Whoop-ah! What? I'm a pastor. I'm not here to shove and use my power and bully pulpit to snap people in line. This is about actually loving and building people. And it took years. It took 6 years. And some people never got it. They weren't comfortable with that kind of leadership because they thought impossible to be effective. But even non-Christians who study leadership, they actually point out something that's incredible. The most effective companies have a kind of leadership that does not look like the Gentile version of cracking whip, or even the attractive version of being just really following charismatic leader. They looked at all these characteristics of what effective the great companies are. And this book's called Good to Great by Jim Collins, and many of you have read it. It's what distinguishes between a company that's just good, which is what's great. Great, by the definition of this book, is they perform way above market their competitors for a sustained amount of time. Right? So there's something in the organization that they're doing really right. It's not a mistake. It's something sustained. And they look at all these different aspects of how the culture of the organization is, and they also look at what kind of leader does it take to lead. What's the most effective leader to make a company go from good to great? And by the author's admission, he thought it's charisma, right? Because leaders that are just incredible, they're so cool. They know exactly what to say. They dress so well. They attract a following. Of course. Why wouldn't you want to follow somebody like that, who's just so smart, who's ahead of the game? You would want to follow. You want to jump on that bandwagon. He thought that these companies would be led by leaders who had a high charisma factor. But when he isolated the 11 companies that were effective, the great companies, he looked at them and was like, wow, their leaders, they're not charismatic. In fact, the defining feature of a level 5 leader for these great companies was humility. And this is how he defined it. Humility in the sense of they didn't make it about themselves, about their benefit. This is what he says. Level 5 leaders embody a paradoxical mix of personal humility and professional will. So they're not about, okay, bring all the attention to me. Let me do it. Bring all the kudos and all of the rewards to me. All right? It's not about the cult of personality. In fact, they would just get rid of that everywhere they could. But they had this driving sense of, we got to get this done. We want to get this done. It was excellence as well as passion and competence put together, driven by their will and discipline. And they said this mix of personal humility and professional will was so compelling that people followed. And they did it that way. These level 5 leaders are ambitious to be sure, but ambitious first and foremost for the company, for the people in the company, not just themselves. Isn't that interesting? That this is what a non-Christian, business guru, by the way, this book sold over 4 million copies. This is a bestseller outside of the business world. Realizing that this is what effective leadership looks like. And I realize that it's important to not only pay attention to Jesus just because, but when you test out Jesus, when you test out his ways, at first it sounds so countercultural. But because God is the creator of the universe, he is creator of humanity, and he is at work to affirm and validate his ways, you'll find that when you do it Jesus' way, when you follow Jesus' ways, there is a fruit, there is a result, there is a benefit that comes. This kind of leadership, not only do people want to follow, it saves lives. Okay? It brings life, just like Jesus does. So it's not true just in the marketplace. It's true even in seasons where things are really on the line. So I watch this show all the time. This is called Band of Brothers. Anybody like Band of Brothers? Okay. Wow, yes, it wasn't just guys. Thank you. My wife laughs at me because this comes up and I can't help it. You know, anybody like me? I flip on the remote control, flip. She's like, look at the guy. No, I gotta flip. Anytime this comes up, flip, stop. And I'm watching this. I almost memorized this. It feels like because it's so compelling to me. I thought about why, and not just because I used to be a pastor who pastored soldiers, and I understand their story a little, and it strikes me meaningfully, but I realized this story has so much to teach about leadership. Yeah. There's even books written on Ralph Winter and his leadership style. And if you follow the story, they start off in a group of airborne, and they're training. They're running up Currahee all day long, and they're throwing up because they're being made to run after they eat, and it's just really intense. Because this guy, Lieutenant Sobel, who is their leader, their commanding officer, he is pushing them. But as you find out, it's not because he wants them to be ready for war, even though he might say that. It's because he wants the attention to come to himself. He likes the fact that all of his higher ups are saying, "Ooh, you know, Easy Company is doing really well. That's the company that he leads. You're doing a good job. And he's like, "Oh yeah." So what is he doing? He is just punishing his men so that he could be seen and his advancement could be followed. Interestingly enough, he's not a very good leader on the field, and so he gets pushed behind. He doesn't make it to the battlefield, while this guy who was under his thumb, who is a good leader, eventually is promoted, and then promoted too. But you see this story, and I don't have time to go through the whole story. Dick Winters, he becomes a major eventually. He has a different kind of leadership. He's not just competent. He's not just intense. In fact, there's something about him that he's not after his own. He cares about the men. He cares about the mission. There's something about his servant leadership that is so compelling. Guys will follow him into a hail of bullet storms. Well, he gets promoted, and so his company gets a new commanding officer named Lieutenant Dyke during the hardest time of that journey that this company goes through in Northern Europe. They get stuck in this town called Bastogne, and they get surrounded. And they're getting pummeled by artillery every single day. It's cold. They weren't given enough food, ammunition, or even winter clothing, and they're just barely surviving. This is when they need leadership the most, and their leader, a guy named Lieutenant Dyke, he's not around. He's gone. Every time they're like, "Where's Lieutenant Dyke?" And he's somewhere off. They call him Foxhole Norman. His name is Norman Dyke because he anytime they need him to lead, he's hiding in the foxhole. And it ends up that he only gets he's supposed to lead the mission. He gets stuck halfway, and he gets his men killed. After everything is done, the commander who comes in and kind of saves the Easy Company, he's doing some debrief with a non-commissioned officer. His name is Carl Lipton, and he's saying, "Yeah, it's too bad that they're talking about Dyke, and like everybody was saying how horrible a leader he was. He was a horrible leader because he didn't do anything. There was no drive. There was no engagement. He made no decisions." And as they're talking about this in this debrief, the other captain says to this guy, "But I did notice there was a leader here. And all the men told me about this great leader during this time who would be so present, who would be helping every single guy, keeping everybody in line, boosting up their morale. He was a leader." And this guy, Carl Lipton, he's like, "Really?" And he's kind of wondering, who was it? And the guy's like, "You have no idea, do you? It was you." This is how humble he was. He had no position of leadership, but he kept all the guys strengthened. He leveraged everything he had to the benefit of the guys around him. I think these are life examples. This is a real story, by the way. You don't have to be in the army. You don't have to be in the marketplace even to find that leadership is so critical, that people see it. When you leverage your authority for other people's benefits, it brings so much life. Okay? I think this is the way Jesus is. This is not simply just a one-time thing where this is all he's about. But this is everything about him is giving up his rights to make us whole, make us well. This is what great leadership looks like, because Jesus is a leader. He's a king. Not just during his lifetime, but now. We find that he's always doing this. Remember how it said that phrase, they're going up to Jerusalem, they're ascending Jerusalem, kind of sets the scene up as a coronation, which actually wasn't. Do you realize that when kings ascend a mountain or ascend a throne, it is a sign of power and position, right? So there is a scene in the book of Ephesians where it's describing this ascension that Christ goes through. It starts off with, in Ephesians chapter 4, but to each one of us a grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives. That's what a king does. He wins a battle, and to demonstrate his power over his enemies, he drags the captives in train, right? And usually what happens is that king is brought all of the presents, the gifts, all of the booty, and presented to him saying, how great you are. But in the book of Psalm, okay, it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives, and in fact, this is switched. This is very interesting if you're a Bible scholar. They switched it. Instead of he received gifts from his people, it says he gave gifts. Isn't that interesting? So anybody who's reading this be like, wait a minute, you switched a word. Why would you switch a word? What's going on here? Jesus is not like any king who, in his power and authority, when he gets coronated, he's like, come on, everybody bow before me, say nice things about me, right? It's actually the exact opposite. He gives gifts to his people. He gives apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers so that his people will be equipped, made strong, made like him. This is what it looks like to be a leader. Isn't that interesting? When you come into authority, Jesus leveraged his authorities and he gave gifts. What would it look like if your home looked like this, if your marriage, for those of you who are married? Okay? If you're looking to get married, plan to have a home like this. Because if one of you is the boss, it's going to get ugly. Or if both of you fighting to be the boss, it gets ugly. In my house, my wife has taken the position, she says she's the boss. Yes. And I have to say, you're not the boss of me now? So we have this kind of funny running dialogue. But yeah, if there is one boss in the home, or two bosses, it gets ugly. But this is interesting that in the book of Ephesians, that same book, describing how the home should be, it says, husbands, love your wives. Treat them as Christ treats the church, where you're giving yourself up for her benefit, to make her holy. Okay? You're giving yourself up, caring for her like you're your own body. That the boss is leveraging his time and his energy, his authority, for the sake of his wife. What would it look like if our homes were like that, where parents did that for their children? Okay? They are leveraging everything they have so that they would train their children in the instruction of the Lord. Not leverage them so that they would get really good degrees and go to great school to make them look good, or to give them some satisfaction about your own legacy, make you feel good about as a parent. But you're leveraging them because they are under your authority to build them up for their benefit. And so we had to ask ourselves, what kind of leader are we? Now, some of us are actually in profound places of leadership in the marketplace, in the church, in our families. What kind of leader are we? Have we thought this through? Have we processed this through, that, in fact, we could be in the church, hear this day in, day out, but be like John and James, and living a course of life where I got to be the boss? Well, we're going to find that we're going to look nothing like Jesus. And so I'm just going to finish up real quick with just a few thoughts. I know this has gone a little long, but I want to finish up with a few thoughts in terms of leadership in this format, even with kids, is not passive. It's not you get to do what you want to do, you get to run the house, or it's not just protective, just helicoptering. It's actually doing the work for their benefit, thinking through how does Christ want them? What kind of person does Christ want them to be? What kind of culture they would put in the home? where even the leadership that they see is a servant leadership. You know, if you are doing everything the kids demand you to do and not stepping up to your kids, that's not a servant leadership at all. Yeah. It's a passive one. It's a passive one. One of the things, at least in our grace groups, that you're going to have a chance to, if you're in your grace group, be able to respond to is, one of the questions that Andy Stanley says that a great leader asks, somebody who is after the benefit of the people who's under authority is, he asks the question, what can I do to help? Yeah. So I want you to think about the people who are, if you're in the marketplace, do you do this regularly with the people that you lead? Do your leaders do this for you? They ask you, how can I build you up? What do you need? How can I forward you? I love this line from J.I. Packer. He says, love is defined as making the other person great. How can I make you great? And if you do that, and you build a culture like that, that's not just sustainable effectiveness. There is such a gospel presence. I want you to bow your heads with me as we begin to pray.